Academics and intellectuals will gather in Braamfontein, Johannesburg later this morning to exchange views on what it means to be white in South Africa. Entitled Whiteness, Afrikaners, the one-day roundtable is hosted by the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection. Now, joining us to discuss this further is Professor Melissa Steyn and Skanti Pai, who are both on the program. Yep, that's the question that we're posing to you this morning on your screens now. What does it mean to be white in South Africa today? Remember, as we discuss these issues, you're more than welcome to join in on the conversation. 33726 is the SMS number. A very good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning.
Prof, maybe let me use the ladies' first analogy and start with you before we get into the issues. Why host a roundtable discussion of this nature, do you think?
Well, I think, transformation in South Africa is obviously always moving. It's not a static process. And as circumstances change, and indeed this year we've seen quite dramatic changes again in terms of the ways in which different people are positioning themselves relative to each other within South Africa, a new wave of transformation urgency that's been put on the table. And at each moment like this, I think it's important for everybody to ask themselves questions about, how are they positioning themselves? How do they understand their role in South Africa? And what are they doing to be, functional within our current dynamics?
I think it's very interesting because we mainly focus on affirming ourselves as black people, and that's because of the erosion caused by the apartheid regime, so that's understandable. But one never thinks about how the white or the other then needs to adapt to this now empowered black person. Do you think those are dynamics that are creeping up even with the younger generation?
Yes, and they're very important. I actually agree with you in terms of how we relate to one another, because part of the problem we have is how we used to relate with one another in the past. And so the conversations that we have to have now is a new way of actually relating to one another in economic terms, in social terms, in very personal terms. So one of the things that we have to discuss is exactly that too, because we've tended to sort of want to move here and say, what do we do now? And not thinking about what it is that we did so that we are here. So part of the, the power dynamic of the apartheid regime, part of the labor dynamic of the apartheid regime, the wealth dynamic, all those things are with us today. And so we need to actually try again and reflect on what has been and how therefore it affects today and how we might actually angle in terms of actually solving those problems.
And I think it's quite interesting going forward, because when my director posed that question to me, what does it mean to be white in South Africa? The first thing that came to mind is privilege. But you can't just use that as a blanket statement, because there are some white people in the country who are feeling like they're being discriminated against. It. They don't get the jobs, so they don't get the position in the school, or they don't get this and they don't get that. So what whiteness means to them is disadvantage. So those are the levels that we're looking at. And I know you authored the book, Whiteness Ain't What It Used to Be. How do you navigate your way around that?
Well, you must hear the irony in that, in the title, hey, because I mean it is obviously it is ironic. It's not meant to be sort of taken seriously. The fact of the matter is that white privilege is still alive and well. And I think that that's part of the way in which white people understand themselves as being disadvantaged. It has already to do with the assumptions of privilege that are in some ways being challenged. And that's the experience that there is for many white people. Because even poor white people do still have their whiteness. And whiteness can be understood as a property. It's something that people have, that in some ways opens doors for them, makes gives them a leg up in life. And because whiteness is a positionality that is shaped through the historical experience of dominance, it is a big adjustment for white people to find themselves in a context where they really, the appropriate historical stance for whiteness in South Africa is to be supportive, not to be dominant. Because the main historical thrust of our time is about, as you said, the redress of the past. It's about centering black people's interests. And for many white people, that's an adjustment that they haven't really made. They still feel that it ought to be the other way around, and that white interests still should, in fact, be the ones that people care the most about. That in some ways, if something unfortunate happens to white people, if they aren't in positions of power, this is terrible and awful and unforgivable.
Is it just in South Africa or the world at large?
No, it's definitely happening increasingly all over the world. It's a big historical flow. The old world order that was established through the periods of colonialism, all right, where the people from Europe and European descent were firmly in control of the globe, is shifting. So whiteness isn't what it used to be everywhere.
Nxanti, what do we want as black people? And I say that because I know we can't speak for everybody. Black Twitter, which is, you know, a phrase that's been used for black people who are very vocal about race relations and politics and the like on Twitter, are very vocal about maybe going to a mall and seeing a white person and a fake smile that they give you, something patronizing, some would say. Others are calling for white people to be more apologetic and to live their lives every day apologizing for what has happened in apartheid. And so you see that there are demands being made for white people to behave in a certain manner. What do you think it is that we want as black people if we were to be so arrogant as to put ourselves in a position to speak for the majority of the country?
I think it's inclusion. So it's really about inclusion and getting people to participate. So one of the things that apartheid, and I think the Prof actually highlights it very well in the idea of what white people saw themselves as and where they still see themselves now. If we think about it in a sense where people, for example, want to get some work, right? One of the things that we have around this idea of inclusion is this idea of capital. You know, there are rich people and there are poor people. But we think that's when we talk about money. But there's also something called social capital, which is outside the money, which is the thing that excludes a lot of people, because when you are looking for a job, for example, there's some relationships that you have to strike with people. There's a conversation that you have to have with people, whether we are talking about rugby or we're talking about our last holiday. And it does actually keep people out, because once I'm out there trying to sort of be part of this conversation, and the conversation's about things that I'm not really familiar with, I'm not part of, I haven't been historically part of, that tends to keep you out. And this is the difficult when people say, no, but you must consider me. Really what they're asking for is to say, can I be part of the conversation? And one of the things we're not talking about, even though we're saying, for example, there's a legal regime that forces, you know, you to include black people, it might be that, for, you know, you say, we are attempting, but the attempts are failing at the very part where people are not becoming part of the conversations, because the construction of the whole conversation is towards a particular, you know, race or a particular grouping of people. So these are some of the things that we actually have to discuss very, very deeply, to say, how do we then renegotiate this idea of how we include people? Because we can't transform something if we don't include people. We hope, for example, one of the things that's also interesting is when you talk about, for example, people asking for more money. They say, look, we also deserve more money. Now, the construction of the way things were was that, you know, black people used to earn very, very little. And white people were comfortable with that because it actually worked for them in terms of business, in terms of capital, in terms of growing the economy. Now the conversation around let's raise labor costs is a very uncomfortable one, because it suggests that we have to take away something that they got used to in terms of, you know, profit making or capital building and all of those things. So it is difficult to have it, because now it's become an economic conversation, but it actually is more of a political and historical one in terms of trying to actually raise people's standard of living, ability to accumulate wealth. But it does actually go directly in opposition of what people are used to in terms of how they've been accumulating and actually living their lives.
What are some of the other topics that will be discussed?
Well, I mean, this is exactly one of the interesting topics that I find, is actually to say, what is the color of capital today? Because we're looking at it and we're starting to think that, for example, BEE has been around maybe for 20 years. Has that actually changed the color of capital in the country? You know, whether we think about whether we have black women CEOs or we have, you know, black billionaires. Does that tell us something about the color of capital in South Africa today? And also some of the things that I find quite interesting, for example, is where the Afrikaner is today, where it seems that there's a lot of threat, and the Prof actually highlighted this in terms of they feel a bit threatened, like, you know, things are being taken away. Are we discussing the right things? Is that true, or is that a sense of what we need to discuss?
Then we'll just have to see what unfolds from this discussion. We cannot sum it up in 5 minutes, unfortunately, and I suppose that's why you have a broader discussion on it. Professor Melissa Steyn, thank you so much. It's Nxanti Pai, thank you so much for that time as well. Former President Kgalema Motlanthe will open that event in Braamfontein. It takes place a little bit later this morning. It's very, very crucial, especially especially if you look at some companies are willing to pay fines even rather than apply the letter of the law. So the spirit of the law should be adhered to rather than just the letter, because that can always be circumvented. Let's leave it there, at least for now. Quick ad break. Morning Live continues after this. Stay with us.